Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing another self-pub and indie fantasy wrap-up. The three books I'll be chatting about would be Unbound, Spark of the Everflame, and Medusa. Similar to what I do with my new fantasy release wrap-ups, I'll have timestamps in the description bar down below in case you'd like to bounce around to any one specific book or reference back to them later, and then I will have links in the description bar in case you'd like to check any of them out. Unbound is a sequel, so I'm going to give some information about the first book and then general thoughts about Unbound so as to not spoil or reveal anything. But Ascendant is the one that I've been talking about quite a bit this year, as I do feel that it's fitting for a lot of what isn't as popular right now currently in fantasy. Plus, I just think that it is appealing to a lot of different kinds of fantasy readers. The setup is that you follow this young boy named Holt, who is a cook. That is his family's profession, but it is not one that ever is going to lead to Holt attaining a tremendous amount of power or wealth or prestige. But one day, due to certain circumstances playing out, our main character finds himself in contact with a dragon egg that is going to be destroyed because it has been deemed a worthless dragon egg, and that if it were to hatch, it would end up being a dragon that is not going to be fitting of the ranks of the other dragons. And Holt just can't bring himself to let this happen, and so he sneaks off with this dragon egg and then realizes, oh my gosh, what have I done? Because I'm just a cook. I'm basically just a cook's son, too. He's not even somebody who makes a living for himself just yet. But he realizes, I stole a dragon egg, which means I have to take care of a dragon, and someday this is going to become noticeable, but I guess I got to take care of this. And then from there, you see the dragon hatch, and you see this adorable bond start to form between Holt and the dragon. And I won't say too much about what makes the dragon different or why it was sort of cast aside, but I really enjoy the way that is done in the story and how it plays out. And then from this moment, though, of Holt starting to form a bond with this dragon, there is a force within their world known as the Scourge, and this force comes through and wreaks havoc, and the dragon riders are the ones that protect society from this scourge. However, something happens where the dragon riders are not really able to protect the people that Holt lives surrounded by, and thus from there Holt finds himself essentially on the run, trying to escape danger, and he's also simultaneously still trying to protect his dragon. He's also trying to reunite with people he cares about, and he only has a couple of people alongside him as he is traversing the wilderness, and those two other people happen to be dragon riders as well. The first book is very much the a boy and his dragon setup. I really enjoyed the way in which that trope was utilized and expanded on, and I liked the world. You get only pieces of it in the first book, as I think it makes pretty clear that it is going to be the foundation from which a more epic story is being built upon. And then with Unbound, which is the second book in the series, I think that proves very true. You see certainly the way in which things start to expand. That includes not just Holt's story, but the other characters, the other perspectives, and the bigger, greater plot at large. And so you get also some, I'll say antagonistic perspectives. It actually reminded me a little bit of the way in which John Gwynne sometimes includes perspectives that are not necessarily heroes and also are quite flawed, and they might even be seen as the villains, but then you, by being forced to be with that character, you inevitably start to understand them a little bit more. It doesn't mean that just by understanding them they automatically become heroes, but you just start to see more pieces of the world through those characters. You understand them, their motivations a little bit more. So you do have that expansion in the perspectives in the second book. It is primarily in the first book, just Holt. You get a couple of moments with some other characters, but the second one is really opening up quite a bit. I liked that element a lot. I also liked the politics becoming a bigger deal in the second one. I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as political fantasy, but I do think that given the particular role one of our characters has, it is impossible for politics to not at least somewhat come up. And then with Holt and his dragon, you are seeing a little bit more of a leveling up within the second book. I will say, for me, I feel bad because on one hand, I can be kind of critical of stories where suddenly a character is just stronger, or if it's completely off page and they come back and they're just the greatest at something. I don't love that, but I also find that the leveling up type of plot is also not really my favorite. And so that is just something that is, it's completely a me thing. I would by no means say that it was a fault of the books to show this character, not only the bond increasing between him and his dragon, but also what they're capable of. I think it's good that it existed in the story. It's just one of those things where it does take time, and I'm appreciative of that time. It's just not something I'm, generally speaking, the most compelled by. But I thought what did make this stand out and actually made it good, because I think there are instances where you can have plot lines where characters are improving skills and it's just so dry or it's super boring. And I don't think that was the case. I think that if you're going to include that in a story, finding ways to tap into not only the expansion of things within their world, details with how the fighting works or the magic works or how those things are intertwined with each other, not just including that and making those things interesting, but also ensuring that there is an emotional connection that you're having as a tether between the reader and the characters. I think that was definitely very present. So I do think that the leveling up was done very well. I just find it's not always my favorite plot line to follow, but it is a necessary one, and I do think it was done quite exceptionally, actually. So this one is one that took me longer to read than the first one did. And I do love that first beginning with any kind of character bonding to some kind of animal or creature. I just love the origin of that sort of a story. But then seeing the ways in which it deepens, I do enjoy that. It's just different between the two, but one is not necessarily better than the other. I also think that deepening that I was just describing, you do start to see that with other perspectives, and I really liked that. Where I'm going with this, though, by saying that it took me a longer amount of time to read, is just that it's one of those stories, I think this is going to be a plus for a lot of people, that it's very easy to just sort of get lost in and then feel very settled in. It is not quite slice of life, but you do stay with the characters through a lot. So I talked about how Holt is a cook. You get a lot of descriptions of food in this as they're just sort of sitting around the campfire and Holt's making food and he's trying different things. And he's trying to see what works well with his dragon and things like that, where I like those details. It does not mean that it's an edge of your seat type of story all the time. But what I like about it is that for those of us that are fans of epic fantasy, it makes the world feel lived in, and it makes it feel like the characters are living within that world. So I really like that element of this. I am excited to see what's in store for us with the third book, based off of a lot of the things that transpire towards the end of this one. I do think it was one of those important building block type of stories. Anyway, moving on to the next book, which would be Spark of the Everflame. I think there's a chance that this one started self-published and is getting picked up simply because I have seen sort of like Blood over Brighthaven, where originally it was just available to purchase, and now there is a pre-order date. And I'm like, oh, okay, I think that means maybe it's gotten picked up and then will be published again by a traditional publisher. So this might not be self-published for long. I could be mistaken about some of that. But regardless, Spark of the Everflame, currently I am seeing considered fantasy romance. I actually picked it up because I did a video where I wanted to get a bunch of people's suggestions for things that I should check out from a specific subgenre of fantasy, or in fantasy romance's case, I'm calling it a sister genre because it's kind of emerged as a genre all on its own. And I will eventually go into other subgenres and even other genres eventually. In asking for suggestions, though, for the fantasy romance books, this one came up a number of times. And I did make clear that it doesn't matter if you think I'll like it or if you think maybe there's a chance I'll hate it. If there's just a book that you are either curious to know my thoughts on or you just in general want to know more about it, feel free to leave a suggestion. But beyond just having this recommended, I didn't know anything else about it because of the fact that I wanted to go in with no real idea of the plot, of the tropes that are within this, or why it's so popular. So I went in knowing nothing other than that people consider it to be fantasy romance. And I don't know that I would consider this first book in isolation to be fantasy romance. I actually think not only was I'll just be blunt in saying there's a character that I'm pretty positive is the love interest in the long run. I don't think the author is hiding that fact, but there's not really a romance with this particular character in the first book pretty much at all. I'd say the full extent of it is that our main character notices they're attractive, and also maybe there's weird magical things that occur every now and then where it seems like maybe something's going on with that, but it really doesn't feel, I really want to emphasize, this first book does not feel like a fantasy romance, and I'm not emphasizing that as a way to say, oh, don't worry, it's actually good, because I feel a lot of people in describing fantasy romance, they have this underlying dismissal of the subgenre entirely, or they treat it like it's always subpar, and that's not what I mean. All my point is that I want to ensure that people have the right expectation when they pick this book up. And if you're a fantasy fan, I'd say give this one a go. I can't speak to the rest of the series, although I hope to eventually, because after this first book, I do plan to continue on. But if you are somebody who is a fantasy fan, and there are a lot of things in just fantasy that you feel are lacking, this book actually, I think, remedies a lot of those things. So for example, a lot of the community-based content that I do when we talk about things that we wish there was more of, we often talk about how we wish there were more family units, as that is something that's really a huge part of life, and that is often not done either at all or at the bare minimum within fantasy stories. And in this one, our main character has a family unit. They have a brother they care about that plays a role in our character's actions. They have a father figure that they care very much about. The beginning of the story, the character's mother has gone missing, and she wants to know more about that. You see the way in which that affects not just her, but her family members as well. And not just affects them emotionally, but the actual consequences of what that would do financially to them, what that would do as far as shifting their roles within their family unit. You also see our character has a mentor-like figure. They have a character that is somewhat like, I'm going to just call them like a boyfriend in the first book, which is realistic. I feel like these are all relationships that you expect people to have in their own lives, but for some reason we don't see them as often in fantasy. It was really refreshing to see this happen in a story. So the setup as far as what the main plot is, we have our main character named DM, who, as I mentioned, her mother goes missing at the beginning of the story. And since that moment, our character has been trying to not only get by, but also try to do what she can to look into her mother's disappearance. And this kind of leads her down a road of discovering more about their world than she was expecting. The way that their world is broken up, it's a little more advanced than what I see in a lot of fantasy settings, and it is broken up into two sections. One is an area where our main character lives, where everybody is pretty much mistreated or on the cusp of poverty. There's a lot more crime in this area. And then you have the other half, and these are people with power and prestige and wealth. And on top of that, they also are the ones that have magic. It doesn't seem like, as a result of them having magic, that there's ever really a way that the people that are living in, I'm going to call it like the lower half, there's really not a way that they find they're probably ever going to escape the shackles of poverty that the upper half has put them into. The setting, a tiny bit, reminds me of Arcane. Not saying everything about this is like Arcane, but I actually think it's one of the few fantasy stories that has a similar setting. Our main character, when I was talking about the family relationships and the other things that are involved with how she actually has to consider them, I do think a good example is that with the mother missing and the shifting roles, our character now finds that she has followed in her mother's footsteps of becoming a healer. It's a good trait to have, as it is a necessary thing within their society. And her mother used to serve the people that live on the other side. It was through that service that they allowed her brother to get to go to a better school. Our main character is finding that in order to ensure her brother gets to keep going to this school, she now might have to take up this role that her mother left behind. I did like that you have that feeling of when you have people you care about, you don't just get to live for yourself. So there were a lot of times that we weren't really moving, I would say, a massive plot line forward. Sometimes it would just be these quieter moments of our character interacting with their mentor, of our character going to help heal somebody, of our character talking to their brother. You had a lot of those moments, but a lot of what is stirring within the main character is this sense of there is injustice in our world and I want to do something about it. I just don't know how. And the how is, I would say, where the exciting plot line happens, and also the plot line that makes you ask the questions of like, is this right? Is this the right way to go about change, and the moral conundrums that come up. And I will say that element of the story also a little bit reminds me of Arcane when you want change, but you don't quite know how to go about it. Also, for those of you that happen to love Arcane as much as I do, I have been covering and doing deep dives over on my side channel, Full Meta Analysis, and I will be doing that for the second season as well. So if you're interested in that, I'll have that linked, but that's a little aside. Anyway, I liked Spark of the Everflame quite a lot. I am interested to see what happens in the sequels, and if I get around to those anytime in the near future, just be on the lookout, because I am going to be curious to see how things turn out with both the genre categorization and just the plot in general. Anyway, last for today we have Medusa, and this one is a retelling, as you can guess, of Medusa, this mythical being, and it is kind of allowing us to see the story through her eyes rather than it just being like this monster. This is one of those stories that has incredibly important themes that I do find a lot of people are likely going to resonate with. I didn't love the writing. I probably shouldn't say the writing style. I should say I didn't love the tone of this. But to give you an idea, the themes are very much the ways in which victims of assault and oppression, at times, it feels as though society does anything it can to either look the other way, to perpetuate the very things that lead to these sorts of acts of violence, or find a way to blame the victim themselves. And as a result of those incredibly deep themes, I certainly think that there are going to be people that can understandably find something within this that they feel is really, really, really deep. It reminds me a tiny bit, not in its writing style or plot whatsoever, but A Dowry of Blood is another one where that one is so much about what it's like to be in a relationship with someone who is abusive. And I didn't love the writing style. I did appreciate in that one the chance the author took, because it is a rather artistic decision in how they chose to write the story. That said, despite it having incredibly deep themes, it didn't work because, for me, it didn't quite work for me because I didn't love the writing style. But I do think that just because it didn't work for me doesn't mean that it negates the significance of it and the significance it could have to a lot of other readers. And I feel a similar thing can be said about Medusa. It wasn't the writing style, it was the way that the characters spoke and the way that our main protagonist speaks to you, the reader. It all felt very modern to some degree. And I do think that while these themes are very important, how they were executed, I thought it's not that it was surface level by any means, because certainly the kinds of things that are launched at the victims in this story are the same kinds of things that you sadly still see to this day just on Instagram posts and things like that, or on tweets, or what are tweets called now? I don't know, because ever since it's not Twitter, but whatever, who cares? I'm just saying that the rhetoric that is used is rhetoric that sadly still exists and that it's very easy to find. I don't think it's a bad thing that the story chose to articulate these sorts of negative ways of speaking about victims in a very upfront manner. But I think why this was a little bit of a clash for me is that when I'm reading a story that is building off of a mythology, I sort of feel that it's important to utilize the mythology itself in a way that goes beyond just the characters and their appearances and the way they're connected to each other. I kind of want it to be a little bit more ingrained in the setting as well. I actually did a whole video dedicated to settings and what makes us feel so grounded in them, what brings settings to life. And it's a really long video because a lot of you had a lot of really great things to add to that. But I don't feel like this one quite did what I was wanting when it comes to having those themes and utilizing the mythology in a way that felt tied to the setting. This is, of course, not going to negatively impact other readers' experience with the story. If you are somebody who wants to see these sorts of themes and tie it with a more personal narrative that has a fantasy element as well, then I think that definitely give this book a try. I think if this is a story that you actually don't know that you want to see in a fictional way with this mythology sort of retelling structure that we have gotten a lot. If you don't really want to see it in that way, but you do want to look at these sorts of things in a way that is very real world, I would suggest looking into Chanel Miller's memoir, Know My Name. It is heartbreaking, but I feel it's actually similar in what it's discussing. Interestingly, I feel Chanel Miller goes about it in a way that is, I don't want to go as far as to say it's more formal. And I also don't like criticizing or dissecting the way in which a person chooses to tell it's a memoir, so I just don't like being like, well, but did I like the writing? And that's the thing, is it feels like a moot point, because just because I didn't love the writing in Medusa doesn't negate how important the themes are. It's just, as a work of fiction, I do think I have to look at the fictional elements of it and how that was tied to the setting. That just didn't really work for me, but the themes are incredibly important, which is why I'm saying that if you want to take out the fictional and setting elements and you just want to focus on these themes, I think Chanel Miller's work is fantastic. Overall, these stories were all quite different from each other. One of them is sort of a return to a lot of the classic fantasy that so many of us don't feel we get as much of, but while it's a return to that, it's also expanding on it and doing a lot of things different. I'm specifically talking about the first book, Ascendant, and its sequel, Unbound. Spark of the Everflame is sort of taking a lot of what we would like to see in fantasy, and it's doing something unique and different, which I enjoyed. And then Medusa is sort of that kind of popular mythology retelling at this point, but very much tapping into some important themes. So I think that across these three, you're going to find very different stories, and these are going to appeal probably to a lot of different kinds of fantasy readers. But if you're interested in any of these, I'll have them in the description bar down below, and then if you're interested in just hearing about other self-pub and indie works, I'll have some others I've done. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.